Our topic this morning is discovering delight in difficult times. Last January, Eloise Eland, longtime Eau Claire UU, died at the age of 94. Her family organized a memorial for her right here in the sanctuary on the 1st of April, about 3 months ago. Her daughter, Jody, opened the memorial with a song specifically requested by Eloise. She wanted all of us present to sing and dance the hokey pokey. Memorials are often times of difficulty, of raw, often conflicting emotions. But for Eloise, we began with the hokey pokey. Let's try it now. If you are able and willing, please stand and get ready to put your right foot in. You put your right foot in, you put your right foot back, you put your right foot in, and you shake it all around. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. You put your left foot in, you put your left foot out, you put your left foot in, and you shake it all around. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. Of course, we could continue on with all of the body parts the way Whitman did, you know. Cindy is going to do it with her canes. So, Jody and her family were introducing a little bit of delight into this difficult event. Does it work for you? Would doing the hokey pokey give you a moment of delight, perhaps especially when the situation is seriously difficult? Many of us live with pain, with sorrows, with serious challenges every day. A moment of delight during those times might be a bit of welcome medicine. When I was 16 years old, I read Henry David Thoreau's Waldo, and since then I have been especially interested in transcendentalists of the first half of the 19th century. Emerson, Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, Margaret Fuller, and many others who apparently were able to experience delight even in those difficult times. In 1830, this is very strange, but in 1830, the words delight and delightful appeared in American publications about 5 times more frequently than they do now. I don't know why. But those were certainly difficult times in North America. In 1836, the year Emerson wrote his essay, Nature, there were more than 3 million slaves in the United States. Out of a total population of 16 million, 1 out of 5 human beings lived in slavery. In 1836, in his essay, Nature, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, quote, "In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through the man in spite of real sorrows," end quote. When I read that now, I do get stuck on the word man, as Emerson uses it to mean a human being. And a few years later, Margaret Fuller wrote in her book, Women in the 19th Century, quote, "Sadly often, The awakening delight of a woman discovers in art, music, or poetry is extinguished by a male brute asking for his supper, end quote. Even in that sentence, she doesn't use the word man. In her books, Fuller does not use man to mean all humans. She was very aware that in 1840, women in the United States were not allowed to own property. Women did not have the right to vote. Margaret Fuller was fluent in 7 languages, but she was not allowed to own property or to vote. Absolutely. It was a difficult time for slaves and for women and for many others. Margaret wanted to awaken delight among women through music, through poetry, through art. Margaret was a little bit of a snob, frankly, but it's all right. In 1843, she wrote a book called Summer on the Lakes. Some of the lakes she visited were here in Wisconsin. Wherever she went, she was curious about how women were experiencing music, art, and literature. She noted the number of books in the houses she visited and inquired of the women who were her hosts how many of the books they had read. She noted how many badly out-of-tune pianos she saw, and she suggested that guitars might be more suitable instruments for frontier dwelling. She noted the absence of traditional art, but deeply admired the handiwork in quilts and other fibers she observed. Here's a passage from Fuller's Summer on the Lakes. She describes visiting a home on the St. Croix River just a few miles south of International Park. Quote, "The guitar, or some portable instrument which requires less practice and could be kept in tune by themselves, would be far more desirable for most of these ladies. It would give all they wanted as a household companion to fill up the gaps of life with pleasant delight or a solace, and be sufficient accompaniment to the voice in social meetings. Singing in parts is the most delightful family amusement, and those who are constantly together can learn to sing in perfect accord. All the practice it needs after some good elementary instruction is such as meetings by summer twilight and evening firelight naturally suggest. And as music is a universal language, we cannot but think a fine Italian duet would be as much at home in the log cabin as one of Mrs. Gore's novels," end quote. I don't know who Mrs. Gore was or what kind of novels she wrote. I'll have to check that out. Almost 60 years ago, on my first day as a student at Northland College, Catherine Church, the choir director, had us do a warm-up activity where I experienced, really for the first time in my life, the feeling of singing in harmony with other strong singers. Singing a vocal part in harmony with others is still for me a major delight. The chords for the warm-up activity are on the insight that came in your program this morning. If we had time, we could do it together. Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller were contemporaries and neighbors. He read her book about Wisconsin before his own visit to Wisconsin and Minnesota. They were friends, but Thoreau appears to have been afraid of Margaret. He complained to his brother that Margaret stood too close during conversations. I don't know how too close was for Henry. Maybe 6 feet, I don't know. Perhaps Margaret was nearsighted because other people also complained about her proclivity to stand really close during conversations. Emerson's wife Lydia also complained about that. 40 years ago, Laurie Beasy presented a Sunday morning program entitled My Life as a Starving Artist. For those of you who did not know Laurie, she is the one who created the stained glass windows in this building. All those on the north wall. Up in the steeple, she created that chalice along with her religious education class. And of course, she created this 7-foot masterpiece, in my opinion, which she called Out of the Universe We Come. This speech about being a starving artist was before she created that window, but she described how it was sometimes painful for her as an artist to sell her work. But of course, sell it she had to feed her children. She described how one year she created dozens of small glass boxes as a way to earn money for her family for Christmas. They sold well, but there was one box she especially loved. At first, she was not able to include this one for sale, but finally she found a way to come to peace about selling it. On the south end of Carson Park, in the area beyond the little train station, there was a secluded path she especially enjoyed walking, especially in the fall when the leaves were falling. She took her precious box, and along that path, she buried it in the leaves with just one small corner peeking out. And then she went back to the beginning of the path and began walking, enjoying the sound of the leaves under her feet and the color of those leaves still in the branches. When she came to the box she had hidden, she noticed the glint of glass poking out from the leaves. She uncovered the box, and as if she had not known it was there, as if she had just found it. She told us that this moment of delight, finding the box, allowed her to understand that its beauty was not hers to own. Delight needs to be shared. She told us that this realization was one of the most important for her life as an artist. For artists, poets, writers of all kinds, musicians, art begins with the delight that comes from the act of creation, but ultimately, the highest joy is to see their creations bring delight to others. As Laurie's story illustrates, delight often involves discovery and surprise. A couple of Sundays ago, before the service, I asked a few people what provides them delight. Jeff Pritchard told me about the skeleton of a maple tree he passes near the bike path in Halley. Its dark, barren limbs are stark against the sky, but in the fields nearby, he notices shoots of young maples, and this proof of renewal and rebirth gives him delight. John DeRicra told me he finds a surprising delight in the first cold snap of the fall or the first hot day in spring. He said he likes the contrast. I think he called it, quote, the Frisian of transition. I had to look up the word Frisian because it is not part of my working vocabulary, but thank you, John. Anne Louise Succi told me it provides her delight to remember her friend and once neighbor, Ben Logan, who wrote the book, The Land Remembers. Alan Jackson, who lives in hospice, is delighted to think about his great-grandson growing up in France. You go to visit Alan and he is studying French. Surprise is often one of the elements of delight, but sometimes it is not so pleasant. Some people love surprise parties, but I know several who hate them. That's one of the difficulties with delight. It is sometimes a close neighbor to dismay. The person who organizes the surprise might be delighted, while the victim might be dismayed. I have a little artifact too. I'll tell you about Virginia Stromer, or Virgie, as she was called. She lived to be 114. And for a couple of years, she was the oldest person in the United States. The Saturday Evening Post did a story about her, including photos of her smoking her corncob pipe. She was a resident of the same nursing home in Medford, Wisconsin, where my mother lived the final 5 years of her life. Although Virgie was famous for her long life, she was not a favorite at the Medford nursing home. She was fond of what are sometimes called practical jokes. She had a supply of whoopee cushions, fake vomit and blood, spiders and snakes. She mostly used a wheelchair, but even into her final years, she could push herself around with alarming velocity. Even in midwinter, she was allowed to go out into the courtyard to smoke her pipe. Virgie's life had not been easy. She had her first child at the age of 16. In fact, that child, her oldest daughter, age 98, was also living in the same nursing home. Another of her daughters had burned to death when Virgie's moonshine still had exploded in 1931. If the sheriff had not been one of her best customers, she might have gone to jail. Virgie's source of delight, her favorite source of delight, was a jack-in-the-box. She took it with her wherever she went. She liked to come up close to another resident and crank her jack-in-the-box. But she would crank it only a turn or two. Not all the way. So the people around her never knew when the pop would come. She enjoyed seeing others experience nervous suspense. Then, at some point, Jack would suddenly pop up, and the poor old people around her would gasp in alarm while Virgie cackled. Well, her favorite victim for this little fun trick was her own daughter, who finally one day managed to get the jack-in-the-box away from her mother. But somehow, the next time I visited my mother, she had one again. The gossips in the nursing home claimed that she had some secret information about the custodian and that Virgie had blackmailed him into bringing her another one. So when a jack-in-the-box pops up, do we feel delight or alarm? All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey stopped to pull up his socks. Pop goes the weasel. What do you think? Well, Margaret Fuller hoped all humans could appreciate the delights of poetry. We heard 2 poems, Hope is a Thing with Feathers, and a few lines from I Sing the Body Electric. Hearing music, reading poetry, or viewing art are all powerful sources of delight for human beings. Creating is even more delightful. It is better for us to make music, to write poetry, to create art. It's even better than just hearing it or seeing it. We'll try it right now to see if that is true, if we got some time. Do we? Oh, okay. Okay. So one of the worship associates is giving me guidance here. And in the order of service there is a program. I mean a little slip of paper. On one side are the notes that you would need to do that chord warm-up that I found delightful when I was an 18-year-old. And the other side are a couple of haiku. And I thought that it would be fun to try to write a haiku. So you could either do it by yourself, or if you want to find a partner sitting close to you and do it together, that would work too. And let's take, haiku is only, 5, 7, 5. Let's take 2.5 minutes and see if we can write some haiku right now. 30 seconds. Can we get a microphone, Phil? Will you take a microphone around in case there's someone who's willing to read their time's up. Who has one that they're willing to read? All right, 1, 2.
All right, we have rainbow is here now. Sunlight, see the sunlight shine through them. It is so pretty.
Would you do it once more? I couldn't hear it.
Rainbow is here now. See the sunlight shine through them. It is so pretty.
Thank you. I think David was next. Oh, okay.
One of my delights is sitting on my front porch. I have a rhododendron bush. This space full of bumblebees. Bumblebee near me. Rhododendron flower to search out each other.
Delight ever here, no matter what happens there. Joy springs forth before.
I just have to give you some back information that I was sitting here and old-time member Nadine came. I haven't seen her for ages. So I wrote this. Welcome back, Nadine. You bring smiles. I remember your dancing spirit.
One more. We got 2 more.
My cat loves the sun. Worship it, she does each day. Don't dare take her spot.
Music seems better when played on the piano by Julia Brown.
Yeah.
Rainstorm happened last night. Wet and wonderful dampness. Mold surely be next.
It can be boring. Today, a joy to behold. Grateful sitters smile.
This is entitled La Cucaracha. Brave little cockroach, fear not. We are all broken. Take my hand and walk.
Oh. Thank you all for those. So, I hope for each of us this morning, many moments of delight. If we are feeling sad, discouraged, disappointed, or physical pain, I hope the music you hear or creates lifts you with delight. I hope the movement of the leaves in the trees, the fluttering of birds, the sound of a child laughing, the pop of a weasel, the sudden sight of a bright color, may they all visit you and me, and give us many moments of delight. Until we meet again, peace and delight be with you. And do we have time for? Yeah, no, I mean for dialogue. No.